Media at McGill is a hub of research, scholarship, and public outreach on issues and controversies in media, technology, and culture. Visit us online at media.mcgill.ca.
Power in the country, in that whole area, to sit down and agree on a national government, peaceful government, and for all these regional powers to guarantee peace and security there for the next 5 years, to give the country a chance to breathe. Because you can't talk about democracy or anything like that if people can't breathe in a country. And this is barely reported. You know, you'd read, I mean, I was watching the television news before I came here today. And you know, the ticker tape that runs underneath the news, which sometimes can be more interesting than what you're actually seeing. But it said the actions carried out by Canadians in one part of Afghanistan were reported to be a huge success. This is nonsense. Absolute nonsense. The British used to say it, the United States used to say it. It's nonsense. It's not going to work. And good journalists should be out there reporting what is going on in that country and why it is turning against a foreign occupation. It's not a big mystery. Occasionally, Pakistani journalists go in and do report what's going on. And it works, you know, the reporting is quite good. So in times of war, how a war is reported is increasingly vital in the formation of public opinion. Sometimes public opinion doesn't even need it, it gets worked up. But in the case of Afghanistan, about which very little is known, it does need it. And it should need it, but it doesn't get it. Now, there is a problem, another problem, which is linked to the problem of the media, which is what is happening to politics in the Western world. I mean, if you look just at the caliber of politicians that are being produced in the Western world, regardless of whether they're from the center-left or center-right or whatever their politics may be, you have to realize that the standards have deteriorated phenomenally. I mean, just if you go back to the period of the Second World War, you had de Gaulle, Adenauer, Churchill, three, you know, major political leaders of the right, and one disagreed with them, but you knew what they said. You could argue with them. You had Attlee, the Labour leader in Britain, a very mild-spoken man who didn't do well on television, but very sharp, very effective. These leaders no longer exist. Instead, you largely have confected politicians. And these confected politicians are over-dependent on the media because it's their only real contact with the population, because of the decline we are seeing in political parties and their ability to mobilize people in the Western world. And when you see that, then you understand the symbiosis which exists between politicians and the media, and why they get very agitated when the media or sections of the media defy them or challenge them. Classic case in point is the BBC. This is an institution which, you know, people still respect. But this respect is declining very rapidly because of what happened to it under Blair during the Iraq War, where the BBC Director General confronted a big problem. Normally, balance, as they call it, is determined by the interplay of parliamentary debates. But what happens when there are no debates? What happens when the country goes to war and the main opposition party and the government party are in total agreement? When that happens, what does the BBC do? Greg Dyke, the Director General of the BBC, said we had a choice. The bulk of the country was against the war. 1.5 million people had marched against the war in the largest political demonstration in British history. The politicians were for the war. What the hell could we do? We had to give voice to anti-war people. And he said the constant pressure from 10 Downing Street become unbearable. And the letters now have been published between Greg Dyke and Tony Blair. And Tony Blair more or less says to him, you're being hostile. And Greg Dyke says, you have your job to do as Prime Minister of Britain, and I have my job to do, and they are not the same jobs. And I have to run a public broadcasting network and tell people as much truth as I can. And Blair then replies, or Blair's chief of staff replies, but how come in all your current affairs programs, the bulk of the people you find are anti-war? And Dyke says that reflects the country. It's very difficult for us to find pro-war people to even bus into our programs. And the government then says, well, we will help you out on that. And they do. I was in one of these programs, Question Time, and I just said to the BBC producer, I said, something's changed. I said, who supplied half these people? And they said, oh, the government told us. Well, I said, right, say no more. So the pressures were very great, and finally, Blair couldn't contain himself, set up a tame court to condemn the BBC, sacked Greg Dyke, sacked the chairman of the Board of Governors of the BBC, and the BBC immediately imposed a self-censorship. There was no official censorship, but they imposed a self-censorship. And so we have increasingly government exercising its influence, and then we have the commercial channels exercising another influence. Whereas when public service broadcasting was set up, you had the commercial television channels which followed it using public broadcasting standards as a guide and a criteria. That has now become exactly the opposite. And many public service networks actually are waiting to be privatized. That's the way it seems when you watch some of the stuff they're putting out on their channels. And that, I think, would be a tragedy if it happened, because that does all these things begin to impact on democracy. And then people wonder, why aren't young people so not as engaged as they used to be? They are alienated. That's why in the last 2 general elections in Britain, a majority of young people between the ages of 18 and 26 didn't bother to vote. Didn't bother to vote. And Gordon Brown, the new Prime Minister, when asked about this, said, oh, the reason they aren't voting is because they're perfectly happy with what we're doing. He actually said that. And he should have gone to Hackney in the East End of London and seen the slogans that were chalked up. And the slogan, one slogan which was very dominant during the last election was, if voting changed anything, they'd abolish it. That's the sort of anger and alienation that exists. And so what we are now seeing is attempts to create alternative networks. The United States, where the channels really went under in the 90s, is the country where alternative media is probably the most advanced. I often give this example. Here you still have some public media, in some room, some space, as in Britain, getting reduced, but it's still there. In the United States, all this space disappeared. So you have Amy Goodman's Democracy Now!, which goes out every morning with an alternative news, which is different from the mainstream news, and about 3 million Americans watch it or listen to it or get it on the web later. And that is what is going on. So it's not a case for despairing, but it's a case for seeing where to get the news from, how to get it. There are some websites which go electric whenever there's a war on. People turn to them to try and get the news. The editor of The Guardian in Britain once told me that after 9/11, the week following 9/11, the hits on The Guardian's website from the United States increased by 1.5 million. And that's a good sign, that there were 1.5 million Americans who wanted to read something different than from what they were getting. So it's not all over in that sense. Things are changing. And if politics and media, total mainstream politics in the